There's a photograph that exists somewhere in the archives of World War II history. It's not famous. You won't find it in textbooks or museums, but the man who took it kept it for 60 years, tucked away in a drawer, because every time he looked at it, he was reminded of something impossible. He was reminded of the day his enemy saved his life. December 1944. The Pacific Theater, a place where the fighting had become so bitter, so absolute, that the very idea of mercy seemed like a relic from another world. Americans and Japanese faced each other across vast stretches of ocean, and the propaganda on both sides had done its work well. The enemy wasn't human. The enemy deserved no quarter. And yet, this is the story of Lieutenant Charlie Thompson, a B-24 pilot from Oklahoma who should have died over the Pacific. And this is the story of a Japanese pilot, whose name we may never know, who made a choice that defied everything his culture, his training, and his war had taught him. It's a story about what happens when two men, separated by language and loyalty and every conceivable divide, meet in a moment where only one thing matters: whether we can still recognize each other as human beings. Some acts of courage happen in front of thousands. Others happen where no one is watching, in the space between two aircraft over an endless sea, where the only witnesses are the men involved and the sky itself. This is one of those stories. December 7th, 1944, exactly 3 years after Pearl Harbor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the 43rd Bomb Group as they prepared for their morning briefing on Los Negros Island and the Admiralty Islands. Lieutenant Charlie Thompson was 23 years old, though he felt about 40. He'd been flying combat missions for 8 months, and every single one aged you in ways that had nothing to do with time. His crew called him lucky, not because good things happened to him, but because bad things kept almost happening and then didn't. His B-24 Liberator, which his crew had named Prairie Rose after Charlie's sweetheart back home, was scheduled for a long-range reconnaissance mission over Japanese-held waters near the Philippines. It wasn't supposed to be particularly dangerous. They'd fly high, stay out of range of anti-aircraft fire, take some photographs, and head home in time for the powdered eggs that passed for breakfast. War, however, rarely respects your schedule. Charlie's crew consisted of 9 other men. There was Tom Reynolds, the co-pilot, who'd been a mechanic before the war and could fix just about anything with wire and prayer. Jake Morrison operated the radio, and he was the only man Charlie knew who could find humor in just about any situation. The others, gunners, bombardier, navigator, were all kids, really. 19, 20 years old, boys playing at war until war decided to play back. They took off at 0600 hours, climbing into a dawn that painted the Pacific in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, and Charlie hated that he noticed. Beauty felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. The mission proceeded normally for the first 3 hours. They flew their route, took their photographs, documented Japanese shipping movements, everything by the book. Charlie was actually starting to believe they might make it back for those powdered eggs. And then, over his headset, he heard Jake's voice, tight with tension. "Skipper, we've got company. Zero coming in fast from 2 o'clock high." The Mitsubishi A6M-0 was already the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Fast, maneuverable, deadly in the hands of an experienced pilot. And this pilot was clearly experienced. He came in out of the sun, the oldest trick in the book, but still effective when executed properly. Charlie threw the B-24 into a banking turn, but the Liberator wasn't built for aerobatics. It was a heavy bomber, designed to absorb punishment and deliver payloads, not dance with fighters. The Zero's guns opened up. Charlie heard the distinctive sound of 7.7mm rounds stitching across the fuselage, that terrible rattling bang that meant somebody's bullets were tearing through your aircraft. Tom Reynolds was already calling out damage reports. "Hits to the left wing, Skipper. No fires yet, but—" Another burst from the Zero. This time, Charlie felt the aircraft shudder. One of the engines coughed, sputtered, and died. Then another. "Engine 3 is out!" Tom's voice was higher now, losing the professional calm. "4 is losing oil pressure!" Charlie fought the controls. The B-24 was already beginning its long, terrible descent toward the ocean below. With 2 engines gone and a third failing, they were no longer an aircraft. They were a rock with wings, and gravity had just remembered they existed. The Zero circled back for another pass. Charlie could see it now, banking gracefully in the morning light. He could even see the pilot in the cockpit, though not clearly enough to make out features. Just a silhouette. A man doing his job, which happened to be killing Charlie and his crew. "Prepare for ditching," Charlie called out. He'd practiced this scenario a dozen times, but practice and reality were separated by an ocean of difference. In practice, the water was always calm. In practice, the aircraft always held together. In practice, everyone always survived. The Zero came in for what Charlie assumed would be the killing blow. At this altitude, nearly crippled, they were defenseless. All the Japanese pilot had to do was finish what he'd started. Charlie watched the fighter approach. He thought about Sarah back in Oklahoma, about the last letter he'd written her, which probably hadn't even been mailed yet. He thought about his crew, these boys who trusted him to get them home. Zero's guns remained silent. It flew past them, so close Charlie could see the rising sun insignia painted on the fuselage, and then it pulled up, gaining altitude, circling around their crippled bomber like a shark around wounded prey. But it didn't attack. "What's he doing?" Tom Reynolds was staring out the co-pilot's window, watching the Zero maintain its parallel course. "I don't know," Charlie admitted. He was focused on keeping the B-24 level, on coaxing every possible foot of altitude from the 2 remaining engines, on calculating whether they could possibly make it back to friendly territory or if they'd have to ditch in the ocean. The Zero stayed with them. At first, Charlie thought the Japanese pilot might be hurting them, directing them toward Japanese positions where they could be captured. But as the minutes passed, that theory stopped making sense. The Zero was flying alongside them, not behind or in an attacking position. It was almost as if the Japanese pilot was escorting them. "Skipper," Jake's voice came over the intercom, hesitant. "I think he's trying to help us." "That's insane," Tom said immediately. But Charlie was starting to wonder. The Zero had them dead to rights, could have finished them off easily. Instead, it was flying formation, maintaining position like they were on the same side. Then the impossible became undeniable. The Zero pulled ahead slightly, waggling its wings. It was a signal, clear as day, used by pilots of all nations. "Follow me." "He wants us to follow him," Charlie said, barely believing the words as he spoke them. "It's a trick," Tom insisted. "Has to be." Charlie looked down at the ocean below. They were at 3,000 feet and losing altitude steadily. Even if they turned back toward Los Negros, they'd never make it. They'd hit the water at least 50 miles from the nearest friendly position, and the chances of rescue were minimal at best. They were dead men no matter what they did. Unless the impossible was actually happening. "We follow him," Charlie decided. The Zero led them northeast, maintaining a steady course. Charlie watched his fuel gauge dropping, watched his altitude bleeding away, watched his crew check their life vests and prepare for the worst. But the Zero stayed with them, adjusting its speed to match their crippled pace. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Charlie's arms ached from fighting the controls. The B-24 was becoming harder to manage by the minute, wanting to roll left, wanting to give up. And then, impossibly, Charlie saw it. An atoll. A small chain of islands forming a rough circle around a lagoon. Not on any of his maps, not anything he'd been briefed about, but solid ground, shallow water, a chance. The Zero waggled its wings again, then peeled off, climbing back to altitude. Charlie watched it go, still not quite believing what had just happened. "Okay, boys," Charlie called over the intercom, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're going in. Brace for impact." Ditching a B-24 in the ocean is controlled catastrophe. You try to touch down parallel to the waves, tail first, letting the aircraft settle gradually rather than slamming into the water. You try to keep the wings level so you don't cartwheel. You try to maintain just enough speed to stay controllable, but not so much that you break apart on impact. You try, and you hope, and you pray. Charlie brought the Prairie Rose in as gently as he could. The tail touched first, and immediately the deceleration was violent. Water sprayed up over the cockpit windows, blinding him. The aircraft groaned and shrieked as metal met water at over 100 miles per hour. And then they were down, floating, at least for the moment. "Everybody out, now!" Charlie was already unstrapping, moving back into the fuselage. The B-24 was sitting low in the water, taking on weight, beginning its inevitable sink. His crew moved with the practice efficiency of men who'd trained for this. Life rafts deployed. Men jumped into the water, swimming toward the rafts, helping each other aboard. Charlie did a final sweep of the aircraft, making sure no one was trapped, no one left behind. The water was surprisingly warm. As Charlie swam toward the nearest raft, he looked back at the Prairie Rose. She was settling lower, nose down, in what would be her final resting place. He felt an odd sense of loss, like saying goodbye to a loyal friend. All 10 men made it to the rafts. All 10 were alive, bruised, shaken, soaking wet, but alive. As they paddled toward the nearest island, Tom Reynolds looked at Charlie and asked, "Why'd he do it, Skipper? Why'd that Zero pilot help us?" Charlie had no answer. It violated everything they knew about this war, about the Japanese military culture, about the way enemies were supposed to behave. By all rights, that pilot should have finished them off. It would have been easy. It would have been expected. Instead, he'd led them to safety. They spent 2 days on that atoll. The islands were uninhabited, just sand, scrub vegetation, and heat. They rationed their emergency water, set up signal panels, and waited for rescue that might never come. On the second day, a U.S. Navy patrol boat spotted their signals. The crew of the boat couldn't believe what they were hearing when Charlie explained how they'd gotten there. "A Zero pilot saved you?" the boat's captain repeated, skepticism clear in his voice. "Yes, sir," Charlie confirmed. "Led us right to this atoll. We'd never have made it otherwise." The captain shook his head. "Son, I'm going to put that in my report, but I'll be honest with you, nobody back at headquarters is going to believe it. They're going to think you got confused, or the altitude got to you, or something." And he was right. Charlie's report was filed, but it was noted with skepticism. The official record simply stated that the crew of the Prairie Rose had successfully ditched their aircraft after sustaining damage from enemy fire and had been rescued from an uncharted atoll. The part about the Japanese pilot who'd saved them was there, but buried, a footnote to a footnote in a war that had thousands of stories more incredible than anyone could process. Charlie and his crew were sent back to the States shortly after. They'd completed their tour of duty, and the military had a policy about crews who'd been shot down. Fresh faces, fresh crews to keep the war machine running. But Charlie never forgot. None of them did. For years after the war, Charlie would lie awake at night and wonder about that Japanese pilot. Who was he? Did he survive the war? Did he ever tell anyone what he'd done? And most importantly, why? Why had he shown mercy when mercy was the last thing anyone expected in that time, in that place, in that war? Charlie developed theories over the years. Maybe the pilot had run out of ammunition after the first pass. Maybe he'd had mechanical trouble and needed to return to base. Maybe it was all just coincidence and the pilot was flying the same direction anyway. But none of those explanations felt right. Charlie had seen the way the Zero waggled its wings, the deliberate signal. He'd seen how the pilot had adjusted his speed, maintained formation, and led them directly to that atoll. Those weren't the actions of a pilot with mechanical trouble or low fuel. Those were the actions of a man making a conscious choice. In 1987, More than 40 years after that day over the Pacific, Charlie got an unexpected phone call. A historian who'd been researching aerial combat in the Pacific had come across Charlie's report and wanted to interview him. Through this historian, Charlie learned something remarkable. There had been rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, of a Japanese Navy pilot who'd been court-martialed in late 1944 for failing to engage enemy aircraft. The pilot had been relieved of flight duty and spent the rest of the war in administrative assignments. His name had been stricken from most official records as a matter of shame. The historian couldn't prove it was the same pilot. The dates were right, and the general location matched, but there were no definitive records. The pilot had died in 1979, and if he'd ever told anyone why he'd spared an American bomber crew, that story had died with him. But Charlie believed it was him. He believed that somewhere, a Japanese pilot had looked down at a crippled American bomber and made the same calculation that Carl the sniper had made, that some things mattered more than following orders. What does it mean to be honorable in war? This is a question that has puzzled soldiers and philosophers for thousands of years, and it's a question that became particularly acute during World War II. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, was central to Japanese military culture. It emphasized loyalty, courage, and honor above all else. But honor is a complicated concept. What is honorable when your duty demands you kill, but your conscience demands you spare? Charlie came to believe that the Japanese pilot had acted from a deeper understanding of honor. Not the honor of following orders, but the honor of recognizing that 10 men in a crippled American bomber crew posed no threat. That finishing them off would have been execution rather than combat. That there was no glory in killing the defenseless. It's easy to be brave when courage means pulling a trigger. It's much harder to be brave when courage means not pulling it, when mercy means accepting consequences, when doing the right thing means betraying every expectation placed upon you. That Japanese pilot, whoever he was, paid dearly for his moment of compassion. If the historian's theory was correct, he was stripped of his honor, court-martialed, shamed. Everything his culture valued, everything he'd worked for, taken away because he chose to let his enemies live. And yet, he did it anyway. Charlie kept a photograph of the Prairie Rose in his study for the rest of his life. Next to it, he placed a small rising sun flag that he'd purchased from a military surplus store. Visitors would sometimes ask about it, confused why he'd display an enemy flag. "That's not an enemy flag," Charlie would tell them. "That's a memorial to a man who saved my life." Tom Reynolds, Charlie's co-pilot, spent years after the war trying to find the Japanese pilot. He learned basic Japanese, corresponded with Japanese veterans organizations, followed every lead no matter how thin. He never found him. But in 1992, Tom received a letter from Japan. It was from a woman who said her father had been a Navy pilot during the war. She'd read an article Tom had written about their experience, and something in the story had resonated with her. Her father had never spoken much about the war, she wrote. But once, near the end of his life, he'd told her something strange. He said that he'd spared an American bomber crew, and that it had been the most important thing he had ever done, even though it had cost him everything. He'd never given details, never explained when or where. Just that simple statement. He'd spared an American crew, and it had mattered. The woman didn't know if her father was the pilot they were looking for. She didn't have proof, but she wanted them to know that somewhere in Japan, there had been a man who'd carried the memory of that day for his entire life, just as they had. Tom wrote back immediately. He told her about that December morning in 1944, about the Zero that should have killed them but led them to safety instead, about how 10 men had lived because of one man's choice. He told her that if her father was that pilot, then he'd been wrong about one thing. It hadn't cost him everything. It had given 10 men their lives back. It had allowed Charlie to return to Oklahoma and marry Sarah and raise 3 children. It had allowed Jake Morrison to become a teacher and inspire hundreds of students. It had allowed Tom himself to become an aerospace engineer and work on the space program. One moment of mercy had rippled forward through decades, through generations, creating lives and possibilities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. If her father was that pilot, Tom wrote, then he'd been a hero in the truest sense of the word. Not because he'd destroyed his enemies, but because he'd saved them.
Charlie Thompson died in 2003 at the age of 82. At his funeral, his 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren gathered to remember him. They were a family that existed because, on a December morning in 1944, a Japanese pilot chose compassion over duty. The story of the Prairie Rose is not unique. If you dig deep enough into the archives of World War II, you find these moments scattered throughout the conflict. A German tank commander who let Allied medics evacuate wounded. An American pilot who escorted a damaged Japanese aircraft back toward its base. Small acts of mercy in a war defined by its lack of mercy. We don't tell these stories to diminish the horror of war or to pretend that the conflict was anything other than what it was, a catastrophic failure of civilization that cost tens of millions of lives. We tell them because they remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, even when every force around us demands we abandon our humanity, we remain capable of choosing differently. That Japanese pilot, whose name we may never know, whose face Charlie saw only as a silhouette in a cockpit, made a choice that transcended nation and ideology and the artificial divisions we create between us and them. He looked at 10 men who were supposed to be his enemies and saw instead 10 men. And he decided that was enough. In a war where millions died, where entire cities were reduced to ash, where the machinery of death operated on an industrial scale, one pilot's decision to spare one crew seems almost insignificantly small. And yet for Charlie Thompson and his 9 crewmates, for their families and descendants, for everyone whose lives were touched by those 10 men, that decision meant everything. Honor, real honor, doesn't always look like we expect it to. Sometimes it's not about glory or victory or even survival. Sometimes it's about recognizing, in the midst of chaos and hatred and fear, that the person in your crosshairs is not so different from you, that they want to live, that they have people who love them, that their life has value that transcends any military objective. The Japanese pilot who saved the crew of the Prairie Rose never received recognition for what he did. In fact, if the accounts are accurate, he was punished for it. But somewhere in the vast Pacific, on a morning when the sky was painted gold and pink, he made a choice that proved we are never so far gone that we can't find our way back to our humanity. And perhaps that's the lesson we need most. Not that war brings out the best in us, it doesn't. But that even in war, even when everything seems lost, we still have the capacity to choose mercy, to see our enemy as human, to decide that some things are more important than victory. 10 men lived because one man chose compassion, and those 10 men lived lives and loved people and created futures that wouldn't have existed otherwise. The mathematics of mercy operate on a scale we can barely comprehend. The next time you face a choice between hardness and compassion, between following orders and following your conscience, between the easy path of hatred and the difficult path of understanding, remember the pilot who chose differently. Remember that your choices echo forward in ways you'll never fully see. And remember that in the space between enemy aircraft over an endless ocean, 2 men who were supposed to kill each other discovered instead what it means to be human. That's what honor really looks like. If this story moved you, please share it. These tales of humanity in the midst of war need to be remembered, not because they erase the horror, but because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, we remain capable of light. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.